Hey friends, Matt aka Martiln here, and in this video I want to show you how you can make basically any sound talk by creating your very own Formant filter. In this video I'm going to be using Ableton Live, but you can use pretty much any digital audio workstation you like, and we're going to be using EQs and filters to achieve this effect. Let's dive right in. So first off, what is a formant? Well, a formant is effectively a resonant frequency, which means it's a frequency that's been boosted by a fairly significant amount. In human speech, a formant is a resonant frequency of the vocal tract, and these actually change based on the formation of different vowel sounds. For example, oo has a different formant to ah. However, in the case of human speech, there are actually multiple formants or resonant frequencies that typically combine together to create these vowel sounds. And it's generally speaking the first 2 or 3 of these formants that really give the vowel its distinct sound and shape. Now, in a real-world scenario, these actual formant frequencies vary from person to person, and even within the same vowel sounds in the same person, you can have different formant frequencies, but we can emulate the effects of these formant frequencies by using EQs and filters inside of our DAW. By the way, this is Matt from the future re-recording this intro because it was really blurry the first time I recorded it, so now you're gonna get Matt from the past. So I'm going to demonstrate this using a sawtooth wave. Here in Ableton Live, I have an operator loaded up on a new MIDI track, which is playing a sawtooth wave on the note E0, and it sounds like this. Now, the reason I'm using a sawtooth wave to demonstrate this is because it's really harmonically rich, which means it has a lot of frequency content across the frequency spectrum. And when we play it lower down in frequency or in pitch, we actually get a lot more of those higher frequencies coming through, and it becomes a lot more obvious to hear the effects of these formant filters. You can achieve this talking effect with pretty much any sound, but I recommend you choose a sound that's fairly harmonically dense, meaning that it's got a lot of frequencies across the entirety of the frequency spectrum. So a sawtooth wave works really well for this. So now, in order to add our first formant, I'm going to actually use Ableton Live's EQ8. We're going to turn off all of the other bands here, so we're just left with a single peak or bell filter. And as I boost this particular EQ and start to sweep it across our frequency spectrum, you'll actually hear that kind of vocal effect. Particularly in this kind of 250 to 500, 600 hertz range. Now, in order to get a little bit more control over the Q or the bandwidth of this particular boost in Ableton Live's EQ, I'm actually going to turn off the adaptive EQ setting or the adaptive Q setting so that this Q control in the bottom left actually gives us a bit of a better representation of the actual bandwidth of this particular EQ boost. We're going to set this to, say, around 4 for the moment, but we'll change this later. Now to add our second formant. So for this, I'm going to add another EQ node here. We're going to use number 4, and I'm just going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to boost this a fairly significant amount. I'm going to change the Q once again to be fairly narrow, but not too narrow. So I'm going to set this maybe to around 5 or so. And so now we get control over the first formant and the second formant, or 2 resonant frequencies in this particular sound. And the relative level of this second formant to the first formant and the bandwidth of each of these formants can actually quite drastically affect the vocal sound that we end up with. And you can see and hear there that as I'm changing the positions of these 2 EQ boosts, we're achieving different kind of vowel sounds over the top of this sawtooth wave. But we're not losing the pitched aspect of this sound. And this is probably the most simple rendition of a formant filter that you can create, just with 2 simple EQ boosts that are fairly narrow in terms of their Q value. And in fact, I've actually gone ahead and put this particular kind of EQ setup into a rack. So if I just close up this EQ, we'll turn it off, and I'll just paste in my little formant filter rack. We can see we have control here over the first formant and the second formant, and then we get an output level. and a scale control, which controls the gain of both formants relative to one another. And if I unfold this rack, you can see that as I adjust formant 1, we're moving it up and down our frequency spectrum and also changing its bandwidth or its Q value. And the same thing goes for formant 2. As I adjust formant 2, we're changing its frequency and its bandwidth. And the reason I've done this is so that I can go over to my Ableton Push here and control these two particular parameters with controls on my push to kind of impart this vocal characteristic in a much more playable way. As you can hear there, it becomes a lot more expressive when we get physical control over these two different formant frequencies. If you want to download this rack for yourself, I'll actually put it down in the description where you can go to my Buy Me a Coffee page and download it for free. And I'll actually bundle it with a few other racks that I'm going to showcase later in this video. So if you're in a digital audio workstation that allows the use of parallel processing chains, such as Ableton Live does with its rack feature, you can actually do this with bandpass filters instead of with an EQ. So this time, instead of adding an EQ, I'm actually going to add an auto filter. I'm going to set the auto filter mode to bandpass, and I'm going to increase the resonance a little bit as well. So we're having a fairly significant boost to a particular frequency range. And as I sweep our frequencies across the frequency range or frequency spectrum, have a listen to what happens to this sound. I could boost up that resonant frequency even more. And now in Ableton Live, I can group this to a rack by right-clicking on the device title bar, clicking on Group, and going to the chain list by clicking on this little button right here. Then I can simply duplicate this auto filter by right-clicking and selecting Duplicate. And then the beauty of doing this is that I can create a third chain that is the dry signal. So I could right-click and create a new chain, and now we have the dry or unfiltered signal. We have our first formant, F1, and our second formant, F2. And if you're using racks or something inside of Ableton Live, you might want to go to the first formant and map the frequency of the first filter to macro number 1, and the frequency of the second filter to macro number 2. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, make sure to check out my video all about racks, which I'll put a card to in the link above. And now we get the ability to control the frequency of F1, the frequency of F2, and we get the ability to also turn on or off or control the relative amount of our dry signal. And we can get some really cool vocal qualities and textures. Now, as I mentioned, the specific frequencies for each formant will actually change from voice to voice or person to person, or even within the same person's voice, you can have different frequencies that represent different formants. But if you want, you can actually go and look up the average frequencies for particular formants in different vowel sounds. There are a bunch of studies that have been done that can give you average values for frequency, relative amplitude, and bandwidth for each format of different vowel sounds, and they're presented in different tables and formats and stuff like that. I'll leave links to a few down in the description below. Another way you can do this is by simply recording your own voice, either by doing something like a vocal fry or a whisper, and then looking at the output of that on a frequency spectrum. So for example, here I've created a new audio track in Ableton Live, and on that audio track, I've got a spectrum that is looking at my voice, and I can look at this spectrum as I'm creating different vowel sounds to kind of pinpoint the formant frequencies of my particular voice for particular vowel sounds. Now, I find this works best if you're doing a vocal fry, which is kind of like this vibration of your vocal cords, which sounds something like this. But if you can't do that, you can also do a whisper instead, which works somewhat okay too. So I've just gone ahead and filtered out the low frequencies, and let's make a vowel sound using a vocal fry. So if I look here now, I can see the different resonant frequencies. Here's one at around 620 hertz. Here's one at around 1200, And then we've got some other ones down here, one at about 2.5 and one at about 3.5. And those are the formant values for that particular vowel sound that I was making. Again, you can try this out with whispers too, but this is just a great way to measure your own formant frequencies. So I looked at a bunch of tables and recorded myself doing some vocal fries and a bunch of different vowel sounds and whispers, and I got some varying results by plugging these into different EQ and filters, but I did get a few takeaways. Number one is that the first formant typically sits somewhere between about 200 Hertz and 800 to 900 Hertz. And the second formant will generally sit in a much wider range, somewhere between about 500 Hertz and 3000 Hertz. And this varies quite drastically, and by playing around with this second formant, you can get some really different and interesting vowel shapes. The second thing is that typically the amplitude of each formant will decrease as the formant number increases, as we saw with that example that I did with that vocal fry just there. This is not always the case, but it's a good place to start. So I would recommend setting the level or amplitude of your second formant in your formant filter to a little bit lower than your first, and if you're adding a third formant, even lower than that. The third is that more than 2 formants are not really necessary for a distinguishable vowel sound, but adding a third and or even fourth formant can be a really great way to add some extra clarity and depth to the sound that you're creating. Lastly, it works best if the bandwidth of each formant is set to be around 100 Hertz or so. So that means that the higher that your frequency is, the higher your Q value has to be, and the lower your frequency is, the lower your Q value has to be, which is why in that simple formant filter I created, as the formant increased, so too did the bandwidth decrease or become narrower. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, I'd love to invite you to leave a like down below, subscribe if you're new, and if you're really enjoying my content, why not consider supporting me by heading on over to my Buy Me a Coffee page, where you can support me by buying me a coffee, downloading some cool things from my shop, or even becoming a member. It really does go a long way to helping me out. There's a link down in the description. I'm also launching my very first online course in October, which is all about the fundamentals of music production. If that sounds like something that's interesting to you, you can check it out via another link down in the description below, where you can either go to pre-order it or to learn more. So once you've figured out some good formant values for different vowel shapes, if your digital audio workstation allows you to create macro controls, which allows you to control multiple parameters with a single control, you can actually create a single knob or a single parameter or slider to morph between different vowel shapes. And that is exactly what I have done with a few different vowel shapes. So here I've got that same sawtooth wave, and I've got 4 different racks here that morph between different vowel sounds. If I turn on this first rack, you'll hear that it morphs between an E and an R sound as I change this first control right here. The scale parameter either increases or decreases the intensity of the effect. And what this is doing is actually just controlling the multiple bands of an EQ inside this rack. So if I open up the rack, you can see that as I adjust the E and R slider, we're just changing the values of each of these different formants here to different positions, different frequencies, and different amplitudes, which give us this different vowel sound. I've also got ones here for E to O, E to E, and one that's kind of good for E to U. I couldn't quite get this one to work how I wanted it to. If you want to download any of those racks that I've made and the rack that I showcased earlier in the video, there'll be a link down below where you can head over and download them all for free from my Buy Me a Coffee page. But aside from that, that is how you can create your very own formant filters to make pretty much any sound talk in a digital audio workstation. If you want to learn a cool way to turn basically any sound into a riser, you can check out this video right here. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.